Hello and welcome to my channel English Literature Made Easy with Saswati. As promised in my last video, I will talk about William Wordsworth's sonnet London 1802, which is the Petrarchan sonnet. So I will not repeat about Petrarchan sonnet in this video because I have talked in detail about sonnet and Petrarchan sonnet in my last video itself. And those of you who want to know more about it, they can check my last video. I will give you the link in the description box just below this video. So here I will straight away move to the poem. And please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so that whenever I post a new video, you are the first person to get notified. So let's get started. So the poem London 1802, as I have already mentioned, is a Petrarchan sonnet. And the rhyme scheme of the poem is ABBA, ABBA, CDD, ECE. Now let's look at some of the background information related to the poem. So the poem, as it is mentioned in the title itself, was composed in the year 1802, but it was not published in the year 1802. It was published for the first time in the poetry collection called Poems in 2 volumes, which was published in the year 1807. So this is one of the important questions. It can be an important question in UGC NET or set examinations in English literature, where they may ask you in which year William Wordsworth's sonnet London 1802 was published. So it was not published, as it mentioned in the title, in the year 1802, but it was published much later in the year 1807 in the poetry collection Poems in 2 volumes. Now, besides the poem London 1802, this very collection called Poems in 2 volumes contain many notable poems by Wordsworth himself, like Resolution and Independence, the Daffodils, the Solitary Reaper, the Intimations Ode, composed upon Westminster Bridge, The World is Too Much With Us, and so on and so forth. Now let's look at the analysis of the poem London 1802. So in the very first lines, in the very first 8 lines of the poem, which is called the octave in a Petrarchan sonnet, Wordsworth typically presents the problem or theme of the poem, while in the sestet he offers a resolution to the problem, which follows a Petrarchan tradition. So in the octave he criticizes the English people of the 19th century as selfish and stagnant, while he invokes and praises the 17th century poet John Milton, who was the writer of Paradise Lost. Now, what does invocation mean? So it's very important to know that invocation means mentioning someone in order to explain or support what you are saying. So here Wordsworth begins the poem by saying, Milton, thou shouldest be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. Now if we talk about UGC NET or set examinations again, where they ask you objective type questions, they may even give you questions like which 17th century poet was addressed in the poem London 1802, then the answer will be John Milton. Now there are a lot of 17th century poets like John Donne, Richard Herbert, Ben Jonson, and so on and so forth. So why does Wordsworth invoked John Milton in this poem? You have to know the reason. And it is important to know that not just Wordsworth, romantic poets like William Blake, P.B. Shelley, John Keats, the writer of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, they all valued and were influenced by John Milton. But the question is why? And you have to know that the romantic age in English literature, which spans roughly 50 years from the year 1800 to 1850, was inspired by the ideals of French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this French Revolution, which spanned 10 years from the year 1789 to 1799, brought about a violent end to feudal powers and monarchy and emphasized the right and supremacy of the individual free will. And induced by this new philosophy of the rights of all men, the romantic poets asserted the dignity of individual spirit. They had an actual sense of responsibility toward their fellow men and felt that it was their moral duty to use their poetry to inform and inspire others and to change the society. So now John Milton, whose dates are 1608 to 1674, who was a 17th century English poet, was a supporter of the Puritan Republic under Oliver Cromwell following the Civil War, which continued from 1642 to 1651. For the English Romantics, Milton became a cultural and political icon, as he had defended the cause of freedom against the tyranny and absolute monarchy of Charles I. In his political essay Aeropagitica, Milton defended freedom of speech. Then in Paradise Lost, Milton recounted the fall of Adam and Eve through the temptation of Satan, who rebelled against the authority of God. So though Milton was a devout Christian, in Paradise Lost, his representation of Satan can be seen as a revolutionary or rebel that refuses to obey a tyrant god that resembles an absolute monarch. And this is the reason, I repeat, this is the reason the Romantic poets saw Milton as the hero of liberty and individual spirit. And Wordsworth wrote this poem immediately after his return from France to London following the French Revolution, and he was struck by the vanity of his own country. And in this poem, Wordsworth draws attention to the problems inflicting the English society of his time. The England was once a place notable for chivalry, art, literature, religion and happiness, yet those virtues have been lost now. Now means the 19th century, when Wordsworth was writing this poem. And Wordsworth refers to the England of his time as a fen or a swampland of stagnant water, which means England is like some dirty, foul-smelling, trapped water. Here people are selfish and morally corrupt. That is the reason Wordsworth pleads to Milton to raise them up, return to them again and give them manners, virtue, freedom and power. Now if you remember, the early 19th century was the time when Britain was accumulating huge wealth from the colonies all over the world, and London was preparing to be a global political, financial and trading capital of a massive empire. And there was this great exhibition of 1851 which was held at the Crystal Palace in London in Hyde Park. And this World Fair of Culture and Industry was organized to project Great Britain to the world as an industrial leader. However, 19th century London was also a city of poverty, where millions of factory workers, because new industries were being set up during that time, and poor immigrants from the colonies lived in overcrowded and unsanitary slums. And writers like Charles Dickens in his novel Oliver Twist wrote about the poor living conditions of these Londoners in the 19th century. So no wonder Wordsworth was pained by this hollow glorification of national pride, where there was apparent social divide between the rich and the poor, where people were selfish and were busy amassing huge amounts of wealth, and the common people, the poor masses of London, were finding it hard to breathe freely. As Wordsworth says, it had already become an overcrowded, contaminated marshland, where chivalry, art, literature, religion have degraded to the lowest, and Wordsworth definitely wanted a positive change in the socio-political order of the city. Then, coming to the sestet, Wordsworth offers resolution to the problem, following the tradition of the Petrarchan sonnet. And he says, "Thy soul was like a star, and dwelt apart. Thou hadst a voice, whose sound was like the sea, pure as the naked heavens, majestic, free." In these lines, Wordsworth again addresses Milton and uses a lot of imagery from the natural world while referring to Milton. He says that Milton's soul was like a star, as he was different from his contemporaries in terms of the virtues which I have mentioned above. His voice was like the sea and the sky, and he had the ability to incorporate cheerful godliness even while doing the lowliest duties. And Wordsworth refers to Milton as a celestial being because for Wordsworth, who was a nature poet, To associate someone to nature was the highest compliment he could ever offer. Hence, Wordsworth is hopeful that only Milton can save the city, London, with his nobility and virtue from its current degradation. So this was the analysis of the poem. Now, let's look at some of the additional information. So throughout the history of English literature, many poets have written extensively on the city of London. And here I am going to give you some of the examples of those poems on the city of London itself. The 18th century writer Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is best remembered for his monumental Dictionary of the English Language, penned down the poem London in praise of the city. On the other hand, in the early 19th century, William Blake wrote about the corruption of London, from prostitution to the exploitation of young boys forced to work as chimney sweeps. Blake bared it all about the city. William Wordsworth himself wrote another poem on London, titled Composed upon Westminster Bridge, in the same year, 1802. However, in this sonnet, Wordsworth praises the beauty of London in the early morning light, as he stands on Westminster Bridge, admiring the surrounding buildings. As against the smog and pollution created by industrialization in the 19th century, the city of London is serene and quiet in the early morning, and Wordsworth praises it in his poem. And this is very, very important in terms of UGC NET or SET examinations or any objective type questions in English literature, where because Wordsworth wrote these two poems on London in the same year. But you have to remember that in Composed upon Westminster Bridge, he praises the city, praises the beauty of London. However, in the poem London 1802, he criticizes the city as a swampland. So that's all for this video. In my next video, I will again see you with a new topic. So till then, stay tuned and take care of yourself. Bye.